welcome on this webinar on stricter waste regulation and the extended producer responsibility for textiles. This webinar is the fourth one in a series of 6. I am your host for today. My name is Magali Minet, and I am very happy for you to be here and for us all to be here. We have a list of incredibly interesting speakers for you, but before we dive into that, I would like to start with painting the picture of where this webinar is situated, actually. Because we are talking against the framework of the European Green Deal, the growth strategy of Europe to become climate neutral by 2050. That European Green Deal is being translated in a European textile strategy, which is the vision to ensure that by 2030, textile products placed on the European market are, among others, long-lived, recyclable, and produced in respect to social rights and the environment. Now, this European Green Deal and this textile strategy will change our sector drastically. And so with this webinar series, we would like to inform you about what's coming up with respect to those legislations, but also how that will transform the sector and, most importantly, how you will be impacted, most likely. So we are here, we really aim to inform you and to support you and your company in getting a feel for where this is all going. And if I say we, then we are 3 different organizations. So this webinar is being co-organized by the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles and the Green Button. So the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles is actually a multi-stakeholder initiative in which different stakeholders like brands, retailers, civil society, standard organizations, and so on and so forth come together to really work together towards a sustainable global textile supply chain. And the Green Button, on the other hand, is a government-run certification label. And thirdly, we also have GIZ FABRIC that is also co-organizing this session. And for that one, I have my colleague Nazia Quintana, who is going to introduce GIZ FABRIC briefly to you.
Thank you, Magali. Yes, so I work alongside GIZ FABRIC, which is a big project funded by BMZ, which promotes sustainability in the textile and garment industry in Asia. So they run a lot of different projects in Southeast Asia, and one of them being the Asian Dialogue series, which you're viewing today. So I will send it quickly back to Magali to continue on.
All right, and we'll be seeing Nazia later today as well, as she will be presenting on the general framework of this waste regulation, because unfortunately, one of our speakers has fallen ill. Marie-Jeanne from Reuse could not make it today, but we have Nazia who is going to do a good job on trying to paint that picture of the regulation. So today's session is on the waste regulation and the extended producer responsibility. Back in November 2021, the Waste Shipment Regulation proposal was being set forward in Europe. And so that focuses on limiting waste export, but also restricting textile waste disposal outside of the European Union. So this seminar really wants to focus on what is this waste regulation? What is there to be expected, not only from the Waste Shipment Regulation, but also from the Waste Framework Directive? What is the impact that we can expect when this goes live? What is the scope? And also, what is that with the extended producer responsibility? And which are the criteria to actually make a distinction between what is waste and what is still second-hand? All right, this session is being recorded and will be made publicly available, together also with a recording of Marie-Jeanne, who is going to give her view still on the regulation as well. In the background, I have two colleagues of mine, that is Judith Kunert and Sandra Vuelp from GIZ, who are there also to capture questions. There they are. So these two beautiful people are there to also capture the questions and together with our experts answer any questions if there are any. So down below in this webinar framework or this window you're following this webinar in, there is an icon of a chat box. And should you have any questions popping up during the presentations, please feel free to ask them. We are there to help you. We're there to support you. We want this webinar to be as useful for you as possible. So is there any question for our experts or for my colleagues from GIZ? Don't hesitate and just ask in the chat box. Some of the questions will be taking along towards the discussions in the end. All right. And then before we dive into the first expert of today, I would like to ask you a question. In the chat, or if all goes well, there will be a poll popping up for you to answer. So we would like to know whether what it is that you're actually looking for. Are you here to just listening in to get a good understanding of what this is all about? Or maybe you are looking for some tangible takeaways already to take home with you, or you might be here with specific questions. So just for us to get a bit of a feeling of what it is that you wish to take home with from this webinar, so we can actually take that into account throughout this hour. All right. So I see in the results that you're mostly there to get a bit of an idea of what this waste regulation is all about. And I also see that some people would really like to take home concrete actions. Well, let's get started in that case. Our first expert for today is my colleague Nazia. Nazia is going to give you a high-level overview of what the waste regulation is about and the framework that the directive is about. And she's going to try to paint that picture for you so you have a good understanding of what are we actually talking about today. Nazia, the floor is yours.
So, hi everyone, and welcome to this Asian Dialogue series on the new Waste Shipment Regulation and the Waste Framework Directive. These proposed policies on waste aim to make waste management more efficient in the EU, treating waste as a resource and moving towards a circular economy. While the Waste Shipment Regulation aims to ensure that the EU does no longer export its waste problems to third countries, the core of the proposal for a new Waste Framework Directive is the introduction of an extended producer responsibility for textiles. This session will provide an overview of the current state and content of the proposals and discuss their potential impact for brands, retailers, and suppliers alike. Now I would love to introduce Marie-Jeanne Gardner, who works on policy issues related to the EU's textile agenda on strategy for sustainable and circular textiles and the Waste Framework Directive. She also coordinates Reuse's involvement in the CISATAC project, a Horizon Europe-funded project dedicated to increasing the circular use of textiles within the EU. So Marie-Jeanne, hello. Thank you so much for your time today and for your presentation.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. It's a pleasure.
No, we're very looking forward to this. I do know you have quite a lot of knowledge on the Waste Framework Directive, and I know we will be having a lot of questions from the audience. So it'd be great to kind of just have an overview, and then we can dive right into it.
Sure, I'll start sharing. So, as was said, I will start this presentation by introducing what the WAFD, the Waste Framework Directive, is and the current state of play. I'm trying to move the slides. You still see the first slide?
Yeah, we see it.
It's not moving. Ah, yeah, okay. So first of all, we can take a look at where the legislative process stands currently within the three main EU institutions. So lately, in July last year, the European Commission came up with a proposal for a revision of the Waste Framework Directive, which was the latest amended in 2018. This proposal from the Commission is now being discussed at the European Parliament. Tomorrow, actually, there will be a vote in the responsible committee, the Environmental Committee, and we expect a plenary vote in a bit later in March. With regards to the work within the Council, they are now examining the proposal, but we don't know exactly when the trilogues will begin. So that is a bit for the state of play. Now let's deep dive into the scope of what is proposed. As you said, Nasia, the goal of the revision of the WFD is to introduce extended producer responsibility schemes, specifically for textiles. And the scope of it is that it will target manufacturers, importers, and distributors who will carry this responsibility. So it's exempt micro enterprises, but also self-employed tailors and social enterprises, or in general, secondhand textiles producers, because the scope is first-hand textiles and that are put in the market for the first time. So the aim of this EPR scheme will be to set up the separate collection for used textiles, which will become mandatory as of 2025 in the whole of the European Union. And as a second obligation, the PRO, so the Producer Responsibility Organization, who will be appointed to fulfill the financial and operational obligation of EPR schemes, will also have to provide consumer with information on sustainable consumption, but also how to dispose their used textiles. And finally, in terms of the scope of the material, the EPR schemes will be targeted at household textile products, but also other articles of apparel, clothing, accessories, and footwear. Trying to go to the next slide. So, in terms now of what the EPR fees will finance, so what the producers will finance, first of all, collection and transport of used textiles, but also all the treatment operations like sorting, preparation for reuse, recycling, recovery, and disposal. And on top of that, EPR fees will also finance the residual waste following sorting process, and also their transport and subsequent treatment. On top of that, EPR fees will also serve to finance some survey, research, and reporting to collect data. Apart from setting EPR schemes in the EU, the WFD also provides some new rules to set that up. And there are indeed new rules for textile collection. We know more clearly what type of actors will be in place. The directive gives some direction for textile collection, with priority being set for reuse and high quality recycling. It gives instruction to protect the reusability of collected textile in that sense, through a screening at the collection point to prevent contamination, notably. And it also gives some instruction about the collection point themselves. it's stated that in the proposal that they should not be subject to registration or permit requirement. These things might change also with the report of the Parliament. Of course, I'm just talking about the Commission proposal. And another requirement for collection point is that it should be used altogether for used and waste textiles. So no mandatory separation of those two streams. And that all the textiles that are collected through this collection point, the part of the separate collection, should be considered waste. The WFT revision also give some instruction for, I'm sorry, this slide is not moving again. For textile waste management, which main objective should be reuse again. It also gives some further instruction on the granularity of textile waste management and say that the clause should be separate for, there should be a difference between clause separating for direct reuse and the one for preparation for reuse operation. So that will require further treatment and operation. It also specifies that the waste status should happen after sorting and eventual preparation for reuse. This specific point, we will go a bit deeper into it in a couple of slides. And it also states that landfilling should be avoided and that incineration would only be allowed if energy recovery applies. Now let's look into the specificities of eco-modulation rules. So what is actually eco-modulation? It means that the fee that is paid by producers as part of the EPR scheme can be modulated according to some eco-design criteria, for example. And the WFT revision does not state extensive requirements for eco-modulation rules, but still there are some parameters that are being made explicitly. First, the EPR fees should be eco-modulated according to the weight of the product placed on the market, according to eco-design requirement in line with the waste hierarchy and eco-design requirements that are set up in the eco-design for sustainable product regulation, and that it should respect equal treatment of producers, regardless of their origin and size. So as I mentioned previously, I would now deep dive a little bit into a separate piece of work. That is the establishment of mandatory end-of-waste criteria for textile waste. This is something that is being done by the JRC, so the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, which is looking into the establishment of these harmonized rules. So the purpose of this work is to harmonize the sorting requirement at EU level. And what the JRC proposed for the moment is to have two separate end-of-waste points, one for reuse and one for recycling. The current proposal, so it's again, it's not a done deal. It will go on until 2026. But for the moment, the JRC proposal is to have an end-of-waste point for reuse after sorting and preparation for reuse. And the proposed end-of-waste point for recycling is after the recycling process. So the output material will then not be considered waste anymore. And as I said, in terms of the timeline, we can expect a final technical proposal at the beginning of 2026. So that was for the general presentation of the policy landscape, the current policy landscape, because things will still evolve. And now I would like to give a presentation of where reuse stands in this situation and of our mission, but also position. So what is reuse? What do we do? So reuse is the International Federation of Social Enterprises who are working in the circular economy, so in repair, reuse, and recycling. And the social enterprises that we represent work with different waste streams, including textile, which is the biggest waste stream that we represent. You can see on the slide that our members collect 341,000 tons of textile every year, out of which they manage to locally reuse more than 10%. By doing so, they manage to create jobs and training opportunities for vulnerable individuals. We calculated that by reusing 1,000 tons of textiles, by collecting, a social enterprise can create between 20 and 35 new jobs. So they're not only providing environmental benefits to the society, but also social benefits in that sense, with their mission being to prioritize the waste hierarchy and the proximity principle via local reuse. And so as the Waste Framework Directive revision and the introduction of mandatory separate collection is an extremely important development for our members, we identified a situation that we would not like to see, which I will present now. So basically, how can textile sorting and management go wrong? Well, what we absolutely want to prevent is that the social enterprise's business model would be threatened. We also don't want to see that, for example, the introduction of EPR schemes would favorize premature recycling over reuse. We also don't want to see the waste mandates growing, as we will have to collect more and more. We should avoid that, but it's totally linked with the fast fashion business model, which we also don't want to see growing. And as again, collection will be mandatory, we should absolutely avoid that it will create additional costs for sorters. But thankfully, we also know how we think that it should go right. So I will now present you our vision for well-managed collection and management of used textiles. And I will later on deep dive into the 3 points, but basically we identified 3 main success factors. The first one is to prioritize local reuse. The second one is to guarantee a central role for social enterprises in textile collection and management. And thirdly, to ensure that eco-modulation rules drive the textile sector circular transition. So a big program. So now let's deep dive into concretely how those key success factors could take place. First, to prioritize local reuse, we suggest to set national targets for local preparation for reuse, but also reuse and recycling, and above all, to make sure that those targets are separate from each other. We also suggest to distribute the funding aligned with the waste hierarchy that will automatically favor reuse. And we think it's crucial to preserve direct donation to social enterprises as a way to maximize local reuse. Secondly, to guarantee a central role for social enterprises in textile collection and management, collected textiles should be sorted preferentially by social enterprises. But it's also crucial that social enterprises' activities will be financed by EPR schemes, which is for now foreseen by the Commission proposal, as I presented earlier. But apart from that, it's important that social enterprises receive a specific support in the transition, financial support, but also operational support that could be done, for example, via a dedicated repair and reuse solidarity fund, as it is the case in the French EPR scheme. And we advocate for donation to be strictly limited to social enterprises to make sure that they will keep receiving high quality textiles. Finally, as I said, eco-modulation rules are a very important instrument to make sure that we achieve a circular transition of textiles. To make sure that this works and that this tool is really efficient, it's important that the EPR fees that is covering the cost of collection and sorting is decoupled from the EPR fee that is eco-modulated to ensure that both will be high enough. In addition, it's important that eco-modulation fee are aligned with the waste hierarchy and that fees are modulated according to the quality, but also to the quantity of goods placed on the market. So basically introduce a progressive fee to make the production of clothes and overproduction more expensive. So that's for our three main success factors. And the future that it should create is to have less waste, to have a reuse sector that is growing, and more circular production and a reduction of the volume. All in all, we hope for this to create more jobs and resource use and CO2 reduction for a green and just transition. Here, I introduce a link to our guiding principles who go more into detail of our principles for textile waste management and sorting. To use some concrete example of how this could be done in practice, I would like to highlight very quickly three best practices from our network at different governance level. So the first one is the municipality of Vicenza in Italy, who have a very good practice of having a separate preparation for reuse fee, who managed to directly increase the preparation for reuse level. And at the same time, the municipality has a reserve contract for social enterprises, which also prioritize social enterprises directly. So that's for an example of what can be done at municipality level. But we also have best practices at regional level. That is the case, for example, in Austria, in the province of Vorarlberg, where all municipalities committed to cooperate exclusively with social economy enterprises for the textile collection. And since they did it, they now have the highest per capita collection rate compared to other provinces, which is a fact that speaks for itself, I think. And the final best practice that I would like to highlight is one at national level, and it's the Spanish law on waste and contaminated soil for the circular economy, which was passed 2 years ago. And this law mandates that 50% of tenders should be reserved to social enterprises, tenders for collection, transport, and treatment of textile, but also other waste streams. So with those three examples, we see concretely how our guiding principles for textile collection could be set in practice. But we also have way more good practice like that we would see replicated at EU level. So that was it for my presentation. I hope I stick with the time, and looking forward to hear any question you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie-Jeanne. That was an amazing presentation. I think, the biggest thing is we love to have an overview of these regulations and learn more about them, but also it's not often that you hear what are the potential, pitfalls that can fall into place. And to be able to see this far in advance and almost try to mitigate that really helps. I need to remind quickly that this is a post-event recording, so I have the privilege to already have some questions that our audience had. which really helps, I think, the presentation. And what I did notice was a lot was very manufacturer heavy due to the fact that, of course, this directive will focus on kind of starting at the source and helping avoid overproduction through the manufacturers. So I do think they're very interested in already trying to see how they can prepare. So if we can just deep dive into the questions, I think probably the most important one being how could stakeholders really start to prepare for compliance already, not just from like a manufacturer level, but also brands and suppliers and sorters and recyclers, like how can they all work together now to start preparing for these changes?
On the top of my mind, I think something that will be very key is being able to deliver the data that will be requested, so the information requirement. And for the moment, we clearly see that there's a lack of data available. And so they should be aware of what they will have to report on. It will be also a lot of administrative new tasks. So to really be aware of what will be required to make sure that they can deliver on those new requirements.
Yeah. And in regards to that, like who exactly is covered by the EPR? And then what is like the buyer's responsibility under this for the manufacturer too?
Yeah, so I will look into my notes to make sure I said the right thing, but I double checked the commission proposal and it states that manufacturer, importer, and distributor will have to carry the EPR responsibility. So basically, yeah, those three: manufacturer, importer, and distributor.
Yeah. And if, I mean, maybe this is a little bit too niche, especially because it hasn't really been rolled out yet, but let's say the importer has distributors and these eco-modulation fees get put into place. How exactly do you think they would be able to either share the load or pass off these fees?
Yeah, basically, one requirement is that manufacturers, importers, or distributor are established in a member state or from another state outside the EU, and that they place the product on the EU market for the first time. I would say that is the main criteria.
Well, I also guess, the PROs are there for that exact reason, to be able to kind of see where these fees need to be put in place and how they can work together. I mean, the biggest thing is transparency, right? And kind of finding like a flow that works for everybody through every level, which is hard to do because textile can range from, companies and factories with 100 pieces of MOQ to thousands and thousands and millions. Um, in this regard, how would designer brands who generally don't have any type of bulk textile products be able to go under this EPR policy, do you think?
I must admit, not so familiar with this. As you have seen in my presentation, I guess you can see that we are more focused on the end of life of textile products. So I don't know what will be the precise requirements for designer in general. All I know is indeed there are requirements for the three type of actors. So I cannot
No,
say more on this. I'm sorry.
no worries. That one's a very specific question. Maybe in the opposite spectrum, if let's say companies like very, very fast fashion focused who produce a lot, maybe for example, Shein or Temu, how would this be able to be covered? I mean, this would be the opposite extreme version. And I think, yeah, just to kind of get a perspective on how the Waste Framework Directive could be put into place on giants like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you have seen in the presentation, there shouldn't be any differential treatment from what the Commission proposed, but from what we would propose and a lot of other NGOs does is to make actually a difference when producers put too much on the market, to make sure that they have to pay more, not just because indeed they put more, so technically it will increase, but really to have kind of a threshold where when you overproduce, you really pay much more. That is something that is not included in the Commission proposal, unfortunately, but that we would hope to see improving with the Parliament's report on the WFD.
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see it roll out, especially considering they're going to be throwing in, a kind of like a mitigator who will be able to balance this in the PROs. In regards to them, how do you see, like, have you seen any examples of these pathways for social enterprises like reuse that can play a role? I know you presented that, and it seems that they will be heavily supportive too.
Yeah, it's already included in the WFD, in the Commission proposal, that social enterprises' participation in the EPR scheme shouldn't be refused. And there's a lot of mention of social enterprises that the cost should be supported. Also the waste they generate by collecting textile waste. And all of this, something that was clearly lacking from the Commission proposal is the mention of social enterprises and other actors like municipalities, for example, being involved in the governance of EPR schemes. That is not something proposed by the Commission, but that's something that we really advocate for, to make sure that they have a say in the decision making of EPR schemes, in the implementation phase, but also in the running of the EPR schemes. So that's something we strongly advocate for.
That's great. And I see that, everyone is kind of really invested in learning now what they need to prepare for. Do you have, maybe we're going to start wrapping this up, and this might be very generic, but do you have any tips on helpful resources that for the manufacturers, for everyone to kind of stay up to date as these changes start rolling out, and as, we start seeing what works and what doesn't work?
Well, for the moment, as the only official document in the Commission proposal, I would recommend looking, deep diving into it, to get familiar with it. And then I think that PROs that will be in place at national level will have to disclose information on specific websites. So at least it's how it is with the French PRO with fashion. They have specific website also with the registration member area. So I think that's where most of the relevant information will be available. Also, perhaps the government website.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this presentation and for your time today. I think the biggest thing, which seems to be like the recurring theme, that I leave these webinars with, is that starting to gather, information, starting to see how you can make your supply chain as transparent as possible, from a supplier perspective, from a brand perspective. I think that's what's going to be the key for not just this regulation, but moving forward, all of the EU comms changes, is going to be how you can almost prepare for a new sustainability wave, and I think that's kind of the goal of making the supply chain circular, which I feel is the takeaway where everyone's working towards, but just kind of reaching it in a very equal level is the struggle for now. Unfortunately, I need to wrap up, but I thank you so much for your time and for kind of going through all of these questions with me. It's very appreciated. And I guess, you know, in a couple weeks when there's more information, when there's more changes, we can go back to it too.
Sure.
I will pass this webinar off to our recording that we have continued from the past. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about this Waste Framework Directive and the other perspectives.
Beatriz Fernandez is the Associate Program Manager, Management Officer at UNEP, Environment and Trade. Beatriz has a background in engineering for sustainable development, and her expertise spans from circular economy, trade, resource efficiency to technology and innovation. Actually, something that we share, Beatriz. So she oversees the UNEP's global project for fostering nature-positive trade and policy solutions. And with that, she spearheads the green economy at the intersection of environment and trade. Beatriz is going to talk about the UNEP programming. What did we learn already? She's reflecting on the upcoming requirements for suppliers and the change in the trade flows, and she will be giving an overview of the used textile trade project that started in October and will run until 2025. Beatriz, very much looking forward to your input, so take it away.
Thank you very much, Magali, for such a nice introduction. And first of all, my thanks to GIZ and to Fabric for organizing this webinar and for inviting UNEP to participate in this discussion. And of course, a welcome to all the participants today. What I want to give you today is an overview of why the textile sector is so important. And of course, we see the changes in market regulations, such as the EU Waste Framework Directive amendment, but we also see there are some developments that other countries may be following from this. So if somebody can just help me put up my slides, please. Thank you very much. So today I want to talk about what UNEP is doing in terms of circularity in used textiles trade. As Magali already nicely introduced myself, I work at the nexus of environment and trade. So we look at how trade and trade policy can be a positive force for change. And if we go to the next slide, please. By no means I'm claiming that I'm a textiles expert, and I'm sure a lot of the participants that are listening just now have a very good understanding of this sector. I just wanted to put ourselves in the context of the textile sector and the triple planetary crisis on climate change, on nature, loss, and pollution, which UNEP has been actively advocating as one of those crises that we should be tackling, not only for the environmental element, but also to foster sustainable social development and economic growth in the countries. And what we see here specifically on the textile sector is that it contributes between 2 to 8% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And that has an impact as well with achieving the Paris Agreement, specifically on Article 2.1, that is limiting the global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, with, of course, pursuing efforts to limit even to 1.5. So this sector has an important part in achieving this objective. Equally, the textile sector uses the equivalent of 86 million Olympic-sized swimming pools of natural water that is used to produce textiles, and that has a direct relevance to the recently adopted Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, specifically to achieving Target 15, that is aiming for businesses to assess and disclose the biodiversity dependencies, the risk, the impacts, and of course, to aim to reduce these negative impacts on nature. And in terms of pollution, textiles also needs 580 grams of chemicals that are required to produce 1 kilogram of textiles. And this has a direct link as well with one of the multilateral environmental agreements, which is the Global Framework on Chemicals, that is aiming that by 2030, the companies are implementing measures to prevent or minimize the adverse impacts and effects that chemicals have. And textile is not just about style or what's in fashion. It's actually, as I've been saying, at the front line in our battle against this triple planetary crisis. So UNEP has this global strategy on textiles and circularity, as we have labeled it as a high impact sector. And again, we are an environment agency, but we do not only see it from the environmental perspective, but also from the social impacts it can create. And actually, it exemplifies that many of the challenges of this sector is on supply chain visibility, on overconsumption, overproduction, and circularity. As Nasia already mentioned, it's very important, this sector, for the livelihoods of many smallholders. Many of them are women. And this sector is incredibly complex because it provides, it's important for personal expression, for cultural identity, but equally a lot of livelihoods depend on this sector. That's why it's incredibly important that we are focusing today in this conversation, because of the importance this sector has to the economies of many countries and globally to sustaining the livelihoods. And I'll go to the next slide, please, to come to the next point, to say that with this approach, UNEP, what we are now calling UNEP Textile, and it's not only UNEP, but we're really inviting all stakeholders to get involved in this effort of accelerating the transition to a more circular and sustainable textile value chain. And these are the three priorities where we're focusing on: shifting consumption patterns by optimizing business models, by influencing consumer behavior, by informing also consumers on their choices, improving practices from the production side, but also optimizing behavioral in existing sites and companies and processes, and of course, helping build the infrastructure and the investment that is needed to create this transition. The next slide, please. So now I'm going to deep dive into what's the role of trade in all of this. As I've mentioned, this is one of the areas that the portfolio where I work in is focusing on. And we see that despite the evidence that associates trade and trade policy with negative impacts on the environment and social development, we also think that trade and trade policy can play an important role in the transition towards a more green and circular economy, and yet the potential has not been fully exploited. And last year we did an analysis of the sustainability and circularity in textile value chain, and we did 2 case studies, one in Thailand and one in Kenya. And just for the interest of today's time, I'm going to give you some highlights of Thailand. So what we did in this study was to look at what are the environmental hotspots along the value chain of the textile sector in Thailand, and how trade and trade policy could help alleviate those impacts from the environmental, social, and economic standpoint. So just to mention some of the findings from this study, we see that in the textiles value chain in Thailand, the sector, for example, it relies heavily on fossil fuels as a major source of energy, both for electricity and thermal generation. And this obviously creates a lot of high greenhouse gas emissions. And if you remember, the whole sector contributes between 2 to 8% to the global greenhouse gas emissions. The sector also is contributing to microplastic and macroplastic pollution, which is also attached to the pollution crisis. And sometimes these textiles fibers, they are disposed in landfills or in dump sites where waste management is not done in a soundly manner. And in some cases, if they're not collected, they can also create a risk not only to the environment, but also to the human health. There's also an urgent need to upgrade the dyeing, the printing, the finishing industry, so that it advances towards more environmental standards in the production element. So as I mentioned, we look at this, in this study, we look at how trade and trade policy could play a role in unlocking solutions for improving the environmental performance of the sector in Thailand. So definitely we see in this analysis that trade policy measures can have a positive impact and can promote and accelerate the uptake of more circular solutions and best practices in textiles in this country. We also see that some free trade agreements between the neighboring countries and Thailand and also trading partners, they have opened up markets for the Thai textiles product, which is also a positive thing for their economy. And for instance, one of the findings is that removing tariffs for clean technologies or promoting sustainable trade finance programs or supporting the adoption of voluntary sustainability standards could be one of the solutions where trade can help unlock the potential to accelerate the circularity and sustainability in this sector. I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm now taking you to specific work that now we are doing in the space of used textiles trade, which links to the EU Waste Framework Directive amendment that we're discussing today. And this is really looking at one part of the value chain. So UNEP's approach is always holistically across the value chains, but this particular work is focusing on the downstream of the value chain and is looking at the trade of used textiles. And just to put in context, the clothing production has doubled in the last 15 years. And the number of times that a piece of garment is worn has decreased 36% before it's been discarded. And if we talk about economic terms, we see that the sector is losing around $500 billion of discarded textiles, which from those discarded textiles, we estimate, according to our analysis, that 95% can be reused or recycled. Some of these textiles are disposed into landfill or incinerated, and they could actually be recycled or reused. We also see that many of these textiles are traded in the global south, where sometimes the infrastructure does not exist or needs some support to continue operating in the optimal way, so that it is more efficient in terms of sorting, refurbishing, reselling, or recycling. And while I'm putting here quite a gray picture of the challenges of the used textiles, we also see these as an opportunity. So there's an opportunity to help understand what is driving this trade of textiles waste from the exporting and the importing source, to have a harmonized approach that allows us to get quality data that helps policymakers inform their decisions in a better way, so they can understand what is the flow of these used textiles and textiles waste. And certainly going more into the countries itself to provide the technical capacity, the assistance to help develop their knowledge, so they can make their decisions that help their economies, that safeguard the environment, that create jobs, that integrates women in the workforce, and that it also helps the countries achieve their sustainable development goals. If we go to the next slide, please. So particularly, we are crystallizing these elements into one project that we are calling Circularity and Used Textiles Trade, that is funded by the generosity of the European Union. And we are working with 4 countries, Ghana, Kenya, Tunisia, and Pakistan, which were selected because they're the world's top importers of used textiles. We're working with governments and different agencies from trade, environment, industry, development, with industry partners, with policymakers, with smallholder organizations, with civil society, with international organizations as well. And the objective of this project is to have 3 things. One is recognizing that certainly there are a lot of organizations, and GIZ themselves and many others, and of course, many of our participants are already involved in this work, you have already looked at the used textiles trade. So this is not a new territory that we are embarking on, but rather what we want to do in this space is to create value and to help channel all these efforts that have been already in the sector to advance and to build sustainable solutions for used textiles trade. In this particular project, we're aiming to develop a global guideline that can help the exporting sources determine the suitability to trade used textiles, which means that it comes with some guarantee that the exported used textiles will create value in the importing countries, and to also create a criteria that helps importing countries differentiate between what is used textile that can be put back in the circularity loop and can be upcycled, recycled, and create economic value, and what is textile waste and what will be required for that waste management to be continued in a soundly manner. And these ideas are really to harmonize a guideline and a criteria, certainly taking into consideration the particularity and context of the different countries and regions, but trying to bring together all the efforts that as I've said, many organizations have already done in the space, and just trying to push together towards the same solution. And the second objective is to facilitate and create platforms that convenes a diversity of stakeholders, from governments, from industry, from trade organizations, from civil society, research institutions, financial institutions as well, to exchange on know-how, on the knowledge that has been created, on the challenges, on the lessons learned, and also how do they shape together the solutions for a more circular and sustainable used textile trade. Certainly, this space will be facilitating also the dissemination of the outcomes of this project that I just presented to you. But the idea is that it does not only stay at that level of dissemination, but that together we co-create solutions for this agenda. And the next slide, please. And I think you will have all this information after this webinar, so you will have the chance to read more in detail. But I just wanted to mention that here, this is more the granularity of this project that I've been talking about, where we want to understand and gather data and sound data, or to understand what is the dynamic of the used textiles, so from when they're preparing the exporting source all the way to the importing source, and how the sorting has been done and who makes the decisions and how those decisions are made. Equally, what are the existing and upcoming regulations on standards and criteria on used textiles and their trade, and to identify the opportunities to help importing countries build their capacity and their technical development and knowledge to not only be reactive to the regulations that may be coming, but eventually to have a more proactive approach and eventually be at the forefront of any changes in market regulations. The last slide, please, and here I will conclude. I'm just giving you a glimpse of what is planned for this year. So as you know, this month, at the end of February, we're hosting at the UNEP headquarters in Nairobi, the UN Environment Assembly, where all the ministers will get together to shape the global environmental agenda. And we're having two events connected to the textile sector. One, Science Policy Business Forum, that will be convening different stakeholders to exchange on how to unlock the sustainability of fashion and textiles. And one, it's a side event on the coordinated policy response that transforms the textiles value chain. And this is co-led by the Ministry of Trade of Turkey and the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management of the Netherlands, with UNEP support. So if you are there, please keep an eye on these events, and we'll be very welcome and very glad to have you in these events and to hear your experiences. We also have a workshop at the World Circular Economy Forum in April in Brussels, where we will be discussing about what's the vision and what type of solutions we could build together for a more sustainable and circular use textiles trade. So again, if you're planning to be there, we would love to welcome you and have you participating in these important discussions. And then we're going to be also running a series of stakeholder consultations. And here my invitation to the participants that are interested to join us in these consultations. I have mentioned the project is focusing in 4 countries, but certainly we are having a global outlook. So we want to invite as many countries as possible, experts, governments, industry partners, civil society, research institutions. So please get involved. And we have other activities happening throughout the year. I'm concluding here, leaving my contact details in the next slide. Please feel free to reach out if you're interested in being part of this effort to transform the sustainability and circularity of the textile sector, to advance solutions for a more circular use textiles trade, and to exchange on what you're doing as well and how we can together co-create solutions. Thank you, Magali, and back to you.
All right. Thank you, Beatrice, for all of this incredibly interesting information. And again, a lot to digest. Also, I can try to summarize here, but I'm not sure if my colleague Nasia was also going to summarize, but I can do a first quick recap, and then Nasia, you can jump in and add whatever that I might have missed out. So what I heard, and that's a striking thing actually, is that the textile sector is in the front line in the battle of a triple planetary crisis. And that's not only from an economical perspective and a manufacturer's perspective, but also from a social perspective, actually. Being that there is challenges on the supply chain level with respect to overproduction, overconsumption, but also circularity and small enterprises that are being impacted, including, in many cases, women, which is then again also a social crisis and something that highlights a whole different scope of transition that we touch upon here. So what I've been hearing is that within the Thailand project, there is different environmental hotspots being highlighted or identified within the textile value chain. I've been hearing about fossil fuel, so the use of for electricity, the pollution, a risk for the environment, for the human health, and then also chemical pollution there, the dyeing in the printing industry. I've heard that trade policy measures actually have a positive effect, and that free trade agreements also between neighboring countries can also have a positive effect, not only on that environment, but also economically. Then there was the project that you've been working on also with a lot of challenges that we touched upon. So clothing production that has been doubling, a lot of losses as well, economical losses. And so many different things that we see, okay, there is things that need to change, but you highlighted opportunities there as well. So a holistic understanding of the drivers for trade, actually, that we can touch upon and then use to help transition the sector, but also looking into a harmonized approach for the quality of data and the measure and how to support the whole sector in that transition, and then capacity building, not only technical assistance, but also knowledge development. And that's exactly also what we aim to do with this series. And definitely, we will not be able to cover everything and have answers to all questions that are still out there. There is still a lot to be discovered. But I hear that we're actually gearing up to collaborate towards that transition, and that there is a lot of sources. So I'm going to go back to that into the discussion. But maybe, Nasia, maybe you want to add something still here.
I think that was a great summary. I think the key word that Beatrice mentioned was, co-creation and working together as organizations all throughout the industry to kind of help find a solution and to start working on projects where, we're tackling a huge issue, right? So you don't see that a lot where, we're all trying to work together to try to slow down these issues and to eventually stop them. So that is really the key here, is just all of us kind of being on the same page. Now, I would love to add someone else to the chat who I have the privilege to introduce, which is Edwina Huang. She is someone who I think would be a great addition to this conversation because she has been at the forefront of sustainability and researching and creating sustainability and incorporating into her companies and Vivify Textiles and Ethical Fashion Room podcast, which she hosts. She's also the co-founder and CEO of Phoenix, which is, as I quote, a bridge between end-of-life cycle textiles and raw material supply, creating new materials from the existing waste without extracting more natural resources. This is something that I would love for her to get into and to understand more as how we can really extend this kind of end of life, which is really the whole point of these conversations.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for GIZ's invitations. And it's my pleasure to add my contributions and perspective in these conversations. And I do believe Beatrice has actually highlighted a lot of great input and also great directive that we need to look into as an industry, as a standpoint, and the impact for such a reinforcement in the legal frameworks. It actually has a lot of help when it comes down to circular textile industry. In my experience in the past 5 to 10 years, when it comes down to working with sustainable textiles, there has been a lot of talk and a lot of interest and motivations when it comes down to the textile waste issues in the forefront, working with some of the big brands that are leading the actual revolutions. However, the challenges that we also do see in solving the circular textile waste issue is always the question of whose responsibility is it to handle, whether this is actually a consumer responsibility, producer responsibility, or down in the T2 onwards supply chains where different part of the producers along the supply chain, is also their responsibility at the same time. So I really thank you for the invitation and be part of this conversation, because in reinforcing such a directive within the industry has really helped opening opportunities for chemical recycling innovators and technology innovators to really help to solve this problem. And that's where I hope, I can add some value in these conversations. Thank you.
Perfect. Edwina, so how do you view, I just want to have a little bit of input, like based off of you being in the industry for so long, how do you view now the Waste Framework Directive as, like, do you see it as steps that are, realistic and can be implemented very easily, or do you think it's going to be a struggle to kind of get everyone on board?
I do see this directive is a very motivating thing to happen in the industry. The reason why I say so is because when it comes down to waste or textile recycling, in different countries, especially in Europe, also in the likes of APEC, it has never been as a reinforced. So in the industry discussion level, it's more the bigger leaders or bigger brands that really taking the initiative for that change. But because it's not reinforced by the legislations, they are doing it as, of course, game changer. However, there's still a lot of smaller brands or medium-sized brands. They are still struggle to pivot into the circular economy or circular textile industry, because there's a lot of learning that they have to take. At the same time, when it comes down to implementing the exact strategies, even though they have been, joining a lot of conversations as well, to actually change the shift. When I say change the shift directions, I'm referring to if you are originally not a sustainable brand, but you have to reinforce it by planning sustainable practice within the business has been difficult because not every single party or department might understand the value of that. And that can be a roadblocker. And for example, you have the design teams, or often there's environmental departments reinforcing the needs of pushing circular economy and reinforcing the practice of recycling or maybe repairing or reusing textile. But sometimes, for example, a purchasing department might not realize why they have to do this because what the KPIs is not necessarily in line with the sustainability. So I would say this directive, it will be very impactful for the industry, but for the near short term, it will take a lot more effort for SMEs to really follow up how they can implement it and how they can plan their supply chain to achieve the circularity. For the bigger player out there, which have been working on the sustainability and circularity in the past 5 years, it's a lot easier for them. But the good thing is, you can always learn from the big guys if you have no idea what to do sometimes.
Yeah, it's true. It feels like, I'm just reading a chat in the box here that Margot is saying, the issue at the moment is every country in Europe has its own systems for data collections with their own data points and fee structure, making it extremely complicated for SMEs to stay up to date, which is fair and I feel is a very recurring problem in the textile industry. I feel like, there are a lot of regulations and initiatives that get put into place, but without so much detail in the sense of how everyone will align. And in this regard, sometimes we have to create our own structures and this gets confusing. And so I do feel, if, like you said, the big guys learning from them, it does help because you do start realizing what can work and what doesn't work. But yeah, it is something that I think we're going to be seeing as this starts to get, put into place and being tested. I think it's in the next couple of years, something that we will see evolve and change at the same time. So it is something.
Yeah, I think if I can add to that, the good thing is all the big players, they have the resources and the investment to test out solutions in advance. And this lays the foundation for the industry in terms of pushing the circular economy or recycling textile initiative. Of course, the challenge upfront is with most of the productions, because SMEs still need to adopt, they're still testing and trialing in a smaller, smaller numbers, because some of this technology might not be ready for industrial scale yet, namely maybe, more than 150,000 tons. This is an industrial scale plant. A lot of the textile or chemical recycling technologies, as far as I understand, are still in between of the commercial scale or pilot scale to actually work on improving. And when these big guys or maybe big brands are doing the testing, also the good thing is that it really does forces the supply chain change. If the big brands who has the biggest purchase power, they don't make the initiative to do so, who else will, right? So in this case, it really forces, I'm talking about yarn suppliers, textile suppliers, even garment manufacturers to think about what do they have to do? How can they buy more recycled fiber so that they can offer more recycled fiber in the supply chain? How they can weave this, use a blend of recycled yarns so that they can reinforce more production on the sustainable practice and reduce all these chemical pollutions along the way. And how do garment manufacturers really start planning on zero waste practice within their business in order for them to comply with some of these important ESG standards from the big brands. So once the big guys are working on this, they're actually really laying on a big foundations for smaller brands or medium-sized brands to really help them through to change and evolve the system. So I think this is actually a very good direction that we're heading to.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting because I actually worked uh, in a factory setting for 7 years in Cambodia. And, I think the biggest issue from that perspective is really working in a factory, working for the supplier, how to get everyone on board. You have your yarn mills, you have your brands, the brands tend to, of course, hand out the rules, but then it's just about how to keep everyone streamlined and the idea of having support and, in these organizations that are here to like for producer responsibility, who can really help you keep track and to do all the administration to support you really does help put everyone on the same level and kind of equalize the playing field. Do you think these eco-modulation fees would really help in the sense of trying to keep people responsible and aware of how much they're producing and if, the waste is really an issue?
Yes, I do think this directive, I mean, when it comes down to implementing in T2, T3, and T4 supplier, they cannot actually move forward without the support from the industry. Namely, let's say if a brand, they're supposed to produce maybe recycle spandex or recycle nylon or recycle polyester, but if there's no demand or no support from medium-sized fashion brands, or large size of fashion brand, it doesn't justify for their commercial research or commercial activity to really produce that recycled material that is, have low carbon footprints. So when it comes down to having such a directive, which actually does put the supply chain in line, what they have to, expect and follow. But of course, I think where we are at the moment is a lot of suppliers, they still need to understand, hey, how does this directive really impact us as a business in the ground level? I mean, then it really depends on the stages of the business that you're in, whether you're in the yarn production or you're in the textile dye production or you're in the textile weaving facility or you're in the garment, because there will be definitely a lot of changes happens, specifically how you handle your textile waste at the end of life cycle, which what we call in the chemical recycling as industrial textile waste. And this industrial textile waste also is, a main source of waste, which it doesn't get so much exposure when it comes down to media. We know a lot of post-consumer waste, but little that consumer knows, there's a lot of textile waste also happen in the post-industrial, where you have textile that dye, and then there's a lot of waste textile that doesn't get sent to the customer because the dye is uneven, or there's textile get digitally printed, but it was not up to the customer satisfaction, or there's textile that is dyed perfectly fine, there's no defect, but it doesn't meet the T string of the specific brands. So these fabric end up collecting dust in the textile mill. So those are the actual, this directive is actually helping mills, even textile mills themselves, to really treat this textile waste in a much more useful sense, instead of, having them end up being as a waste source, which we cannot recover.
Yeah. Well, honestly, it's just an issue that I feel like we will be learning as we go because it is the biggest issue, and especially coming from the end of the supply chain, and it's just post-consumer waste, and it's just the amount that we're producing is gotten ridiculous. So I would actually love to bring Beatrice and Magali back into the conversation to hear also from the perspective of organizations and social enterprises who are and have been actively fighting this, because I know we come from a very ground level perspective and we've seen the realities of trying to implement EPR schemes and constantly, feeling the pressure of having to learn. Whereas I feel like it's great to have a perspective of an organization who has not only been studying, but also been seeing the factors that really do help play a role in getting everyone on board. Beatrice, how do you feel overall about the fact that, these EPR schemes are being set into place? It's becoming more of a conversation. Suppliers, producers, brands are very interested, of course, because it's becoming a reality and not just a concept anymore. Do you think just all of the levels, like the pros are being set into place, they're going to be able to help support these producers once the time comes where they need to figure out these fees and figure out where the waste is going at the end?
Thank you, Nasia, for that question, and to Edwina for giving us such a good zoom in on the reality of what's happening on the ground. So coming back to your question, Nasia, what we see in our work is not only EPR, which of course is an important topic and an element that we see more and more as we try to move towards a more sustainable textile sector. But in general, what we observe is two things. One is the need to co-create solutions, meaning that it can be in an inclusive way that takes into account the context and the realities of the producers in this case, or the importers or the exporters. So really understanding what is happening on a day-to-day basis. And then how do we connect that with the policymaking processes and agendas? So how do we translate all that knowledge that exists already on an empirical way, but also on a quantitative and qualitative way, to help inform the decisions that are made by policymakers? So there's this need, but I think there's an increasing awareness of the need to have this co-creative process of inclusion. And secondly, I think there's also a reiterated ask, and that's what we hear constantly in our contacts with governments and policymakers, to provide the environmental science and the data that helps them inform those decisions. So I think in this case, we talk about EPR, but as I said, any other solution or any policy tool that is put forward, how do we provide the information that helps inform those decisions, that helps co-create the solutions in an inclusive manner? And then I will add, to put in place the enablers for those solutions to be implemented. And those enablers at the policy level, at the financial level, it may be that there's also a need for capacity building, for technical assistance, for R&D, for technology deployment. So the three elements would be the information, the science, the evidence, the co-creation and the inclusion, and the enabling policy environment, and in general the enablers for those solutions to be successfully implemented.
I would like to ask an extension actually of that question then, because what I get from the conversations we've already had and what you touch upon now, Beatrice, as well, is that there is still a lot not decided yet, also on that policy level, it seems. And so we have a lot of people here online today, like suppliers, brands, who are with their feet into the operational reality. And so what, in your opinion, is crucial for the people we have online today to either keep an eye on or take as a next step? What can they expect now, and what to do?
Thank you, Magali. So certainly from UNEP's perspective, we're not in a position, and it's not our position, to tell governments what to do or what should be their way forward in terms of policy. I think, if I understood your question correctly, it's more the people that will be complying with these regulations. How do they keep involved? How do they be part of these processes? So I think, for instance, this webinar is an excellent idea, and it's an excellent platform that helps those countries and producers in general to stay up to date with what are the changing market regulations and what does that mean for my sector, in this case, the textile sector. Two, and what we have been doing a lot in UNEP is stakeholder consultations. And this is one of the things that we'll be doing in the Use Textiles Trade project that I just presented to everyone, where we really want to bring the voices, and those voices that are not typically in the decision-making agendas or at the negotiations table. So how can we learn and exchange, and not only at the high level, but including at the ground level? Because what we have identified already throughout our work is that there are already very good things happening in the regions and the countries. So we're not needing necessarily to create solutions everywhere from scratch. What we can do in some cases is how do we help escalate those solutions? How do we help them replicate and maybe adapt to different contexts? But we only can do that and learn that by bringing in the relevant stakeholders to these discussions and to be part of sharing their knowledge, their know-how, their experiences, their lessons learned, but also their challenges, and together have this mindset of forward-looking and action-oriented and solutions. So I would say creating this type of spaces, inviting those stakeholders to be involved in these conversations. And in our case, one of our work is also bringing the science and the policy interface together. Yeah. And as I mentioned, I work in environment and trade, and one of our work is also to bring these two communities together. And so it's environment with the trade community, but also the development communities and the finance and the industry. So there's an opportunity to create this ecosystem for more collaboration. So I think that could be one way forward on how the stakeholders could be part of these processes.
Okay, so I hear actually a lot of still bringing stakeholders together and make sure we gear up, we co-create, we find each other. Is there any concrete sources that you can refer to and put maybe in the chat for the people that are joining today to already have a look how they can contribute and where to find each other? I know also GIZ, of course, PST and GIZ FABRIC are organizations that are there to do that, but should you or Edwina know other sources where people can really get together and get to that stakeholder meetings, that will be brilliant. So thank you for that. Yeah. Also, there is a lot of questions about the scope and the technical input on the regulations. I just want to give away or add here that Marie-Jeanne, our expert who is sick, will record a video, and we will include those aspects and those questions on the technical background as well there. So thank you for adding those questions, dear audience, and we will take them along and make sure to answer them as good as possible in a recording that will follow still. All right. Asia, would you like to ask a question still?
I actually see a question from Rakesh. Hello, Rakesh. So for Beatrice, is UNEP pushing for DPP with specific data points for enabling trade of waste textiles, but also to put back information for design-related regulations? And do you feel DPP utilization will be helpful?
Thank you, Rakesh, for that question. So actually, we have a full portfolio on digitalization at UNEP that is looking at digital passport, in fact. So as part of the broader Textiles and Circularity Initiative, we're working with them on seeing the benefits of a digital product passport in textiles. And we might be also considering this specifically on the Use Textile Trade project that I mentioned to you. So if you're more interested to learn more about our work on digitalization, and I'm just mindful of the time, and I'm sure there's more questions coming in, my email is already on the chat or the presentation, so feel free to drop me a line and then we can exchange further on digitalization.
All right, thank you. So we've been talking about opportunities, but there is still a lot to be figured out as well. And so there is challenges still also to be tackled. What, in your opinion, Edwina, are the main challenges today for importing countries on textile waste, and how will this policy change anything to that? Could you highlight that again, please?
Yeah, I do imagine at this point of time, because ever since 2017, there has been a ban in China that we cannot actually export textile waste to China. That every country has been left with their own waste or textile waste to be treated. And as a result of that, I do imagine a lot of peers or maybe manufacturers, they would want to have a much more clear steps. How can they actually encourage such a free trade agreement? But of course, this comes into infrastructure setting. It goes back to what I think what Beatrice also previously discussed in some of the infrastructure investment sides, where specific chemical or maybe specific recycling technology are available in specific regions, and where they are set out, and also how neighboring country can trade with them is something that I do imagine local manufacturer and also local, I guess, textile waste recycler are still working it out, because sometimes even it's domestically within a same country. I'll give you a concrete example. I met with the government official from Shenzhen in China, and we were just exchanging on, is it possible to bring the textile waste from Hong Kong to Shenzhen, which is just only 1 hour away. And it's a big topic, because even within the same country, you look at that, and they still treat it as two country, I guess they have their separate policies. So when it comes down to looking at importing, it has to have a different directive that they can follow. And one of a really good example I do imagine that I personally have experience is that UNECE, UNECE also have a program about circular textile and circularity for textile waste. And I was very glad that I was part of that expert group as well. And what we actually did as a very concrete example is that we were able to bring in industry experts to sit together and to really discuss what's the problem, how we can solve it as an industry. And the actual UNECE team were able to mock that up as a case study and share it with different countries. And so not to say they have to do this, but as an example for the policymaker, what they should consider based on the feedback from the industry, how they should look into this and how they can actually interact and what they can do on the ground. So I think that could be a very solid step moving forward for all the interested party to participate perhaps in Beatrice projects, to contribute on feedbacks in terms of how these platform, which is UNEP, can actually deliver for different country policymakers. So at the end of the day, I think businesses in the front ground, they also get to participate and also exchange on some of the important consider factors when it comes down to logistic and supply chain. So that would be something that I suggest could be something that we can consider. Yeah.
All right.
I'll answer your questions if there's anything.
Definitely, yeah. It was about challenges and how to deal with that. So should there be any reference to where people can find that and contribute to that, please, Beatrice, also feel free to share. So I've been hearing that actually one of the challenges is how to encourage free trade, and with different policies being active actually in different countries, even though if there's only 1 hour or less in between. So then I'm really wondering, how will we be able, and what's needed to get that unification in how we tackle this challenge, how this policy and this regulation that needs to be finalized still and then being translated towards reality, to say so, towards our daily operations. How will we find each other? How will we make sure that everything gets streamlined? And what is the role of that producer responsibility organization that Nazia presented on in the beginning of this webinar? What will be their role, and will they be playing a role in that? And who are they? I hope that question is clear. Let me know if that's not. So the producer responsibility organization, can they play a role in harmonizing how we will be tackling this challenge of the waste regulation? Is it something that you feel comfortable replying, or maybe no idea yet, because that might be possible as well? Beatrice, do you have any idea there? Anything that you've seen passing by?
Magali, I apologize, but I couldn't hear the full question because there was some internet slowdown. Do you mind repeating that, please?
Yes, no problems. So the producer responsibility organization that Nazia referred to in the beginning of this webinar is there to help fulfill, all the obligations and get a good overview of what is needed and how to translate that towards everyone involved. How will this legislation and this regulation have an impact on everyone, and streamline that and help in streamlining that? How will that happen? Who is this producer responsibility organization, and how will that happen? What can we expect? And will they play a pivotal role? And can we expect a lot of support from that side?
Thank you, Magali. So I need to confess that I'm not that familiar with the organization as to make an assessment itself. What I can tell you is that the discussions that we have been seeing on this particular regulation, and we've been involved as well with the WTO discussions, where the EU has been a frequent speaker briefing the members about the developments of this regulation, is that one, certainly there's a need from producer countries to understand what mechanisms will be in place that can help them comply with this regulation. Whether it's this organization, it could be one of those pillars, but I would say that in general, what is certainly a frequent conversation is how the producer countries can be supported so that they can continue accessing markets, that they comply with the regulations. And as I've said earlier, it's not only about making some changes in the regulations, but what we see is that countries are also putting in place the enablers for that transition to happen. Certainly, we acknowledge that the resources and capacities of countries depend on their development. So that's also a reality. So it's important that those players have a key role in helping the implementation of this amendment of the Framework Directive or any other changes that are happening in regulation. So definitely it's a good start, and there's a need for having in place the enablers for the implementation.
Thank you, Beatrice.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. Anything you wish to add still, Edwina, to that?
It's actually covered very well.
Perfect. All right. So as you can see, in the meantime, in the chat, there is only 15 minutes remaining. So we would like to kindly ask you to fill in a feedback form already on this webinar. And I will be also passing the word to my colleague, Nasia.
Yeah, well, we definitely would appreciate your feedback. Unfortunately, our webinar, we were missing our technical speaker, so I'm hoping that we will get a video with more in-depth perspective on the technical aspects. I know you guys have a lot of questions on specific topics and what these mean, and we will be taking out all of these questions and putting it into a form at the end where we will be answering by our technical speakers. So hopefully you do really learn from this, and I hope you did learn, especially from a ground level and from an organization level, how we're all trying to work together to really understand what is going on and how we're improving the industry. But I will get Magali to wrap us up too, and see where we go.
All right. Yes, thank you, Nazia. And I think also for us to, if we send out the presentations and the recording, that we also help the audience find resources that are needed to stay up to date, where they can find all information. So we will make sure to also include that. All right, that concludes our webinar for today. So thank you very much, Beatrice and Edwina, for being here, and Nazia for stepping in for Marie-Jeanne and covering the technical aspects as well. We've been hearing a lot about what's going on this waste regulation. So there is shifts in responsibility. There is still a lot of questions. We've been hearing that the big brands actually are at the forefront. They have the capacity and the financial means to start experimenting on how to implement everything here. So that's also something to keep an eye on. They might be able to pave the path also for smaller enterprises to tap into this. But important here is to keep an eye on the involvement of this waste regulation, and we will be including resources for that as well. One final word also from my colleague Sandra on what's coming up still. Don't forget to give your feedback in the feedback form. The link is in the chat, and Sandra will give you an outlook on what to expect next still in this webinar series.
Thank you, Magali, and also big thank you to our speakers and all the questions in the chat. And I would just really quickly like to flag that our next session is coming up on the 28th of February, the same time, and will shed some light on the EU regulation on forced labor. So please sign up, please join us, and we will be very happy to see you there again.
All right. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, everyone, for having been here with us today. We hope to see you on the 28th of February, and I wish you a lovely day still. Bye.